I came away from my first watch of Fate Apocrypha feeling much the same way I think a lot of people do. That it was an okay time, but one with such obvious potential to be more that it was also disappointing. That being said, over time, I've also found that my specific stance on Apocrypha's strengths and weaknesses differs a bit from the community consensus. Namely, I find myself being much more forgiving than most regarding its most criticized aspect: its protagonist. Sieg is, you read the title. Not only is he a heavily critiqued character in his own right, I often see him cited as the main problem with Apocrypha, a sore spot whose removal would immediately improve the series. And though I have my own problems with him, since my initial viewing, I've seen him in almost the exact opposite light. Sieg is one of Apocrypha's most promising ideas. I am partially biased here. I've always loved the trope of a character who's some sort of artificial entity, learning to bond with those around them and find their own humanity. What's more, that's also a very relevant arc for the protagonist of a story that's trying to be an interrogation of humanity's collective nature and priorities. I'm not saying all of that was fully executed on, but I don't agree with the notion that Sieg is what held his story back. I think he's representative of it. He's one of its aspects that held the most potential. And I don't believe that potential was wasted, not regarding Sieg nor Apocrypha's greater story. I came away from my first watch of Fate Apocrypha feeling disappointed, so I wanted to give the story another chance. Since then, I've read Fate Apocrypha's manga, and you know what? I think you should too. And hey, if I managed to convince you to, let me know with a comment. And with this being my biggest video yet, liking the video, hyping it if you're on mobile, and subscribing mean more than ever. And lastly, a big shout out to the translation teams at Beastslayer and Nanodesk for making the written versions of Apocrypha accessible in English at all. I want to state this up front. Neither Apocrypha's manga, adapted by Akira Ichida, nor Yuichiro Hikishide's original light novel, are cure-alls for every criticism that its anime has received. Some of the series' flaws are not the fault of adaptation, they're just problems in every version of it. Even the manga has some of its own adaptation faults, like a slight penchant for panel reuse. But if you viewed the anime with intrigue, if you liked its characters and concepts on a surface level, and think you could have gotten really into them with more time, I'd recommend giving it a shot. As for why I'm specifying the manga here and not the original light novel, I have read a decent chunk of the latter, and I would totally recommend it, if it weren't for the fact that its English fan translation was never completed. So while I might be using it to reinforce some points, I kind of have to stick with the version I actually saw through its entirety. That's not a concession, though. Apocrypha's manga stands as what I would consider a genuinely great Fate installment, and I see no better vessel to demonstrate that than Sieg, both because he's most people's biggest problem with the anime, and because he's the protagonist, so much of the story rides on his shoulders. By comparing these two versions of him, I want to show not just that the manga is better, but what makes Sieg such an effective protagonist in my eyes, and why this version of his story really resonated with me. Today, I want to talk about why I love Fate's most hated protagonist. Before getting into Sieg as an individual character, I think some analysis of Apocrypha as a whole is necessary to provide context. What do I think the story is going for, and where exactly do I think the anime stumbles and other tellings succeed? After all, it's not an obviously terrible adaptation where large chunks of the source material are cut or changed, or where the production quality leaves a lot to be desired. Rather, I think Apocrypha's anime falls flat as a result of several subtle blemishes that all serve to diminish the emotional impact of a story that's, first and foremost, about making you feel for its characters. Put another way, Fate Apocrypha is a story about life. More specifically, I think its thematic questions are what gives a human life value, and what makes a life well spent. That's why Sieg's short lifespan and inevitable doom are such focal points. It's why both rulers are based off real people who died in their teens, and why the qualifications for being summoned as ruler are having no regrets from their lives, nor a wish desired from the Grail. Contrastingly, it's also why both D'Arc and Amakusa have forcibly extended their lives far past the point they should have ended. It's why every other member of the Yig Millennia family has an arc that centers on lifelong obsession, legacy and succession, or some combination of the two. And it's why even outside of Sieg, some of the servants have a loose theme of artificial life as well. From Fran to these specific takes on Mordred and Jack the Ripper being a homunculus and a ghost respectively, to Avitabron aiming to perfect humanity with his golems. The series wants to delve into these characters' lives, no matter how fleeting or how unconventional, and examine what they chose to dedicate themselves to, what fulfilled or failed to fulfill them. And the failure to capture that is, in my opinion, the anime's single biggest sin as an adaptation. Yes, the theme itself is present and decently articulated, but the ethos that allows the viewer to buy into and be invested in its exploration is entirely lacking. The manga, and especially the light novel, are filled with these little moments of downtime between the motions of the plot. Scenes that exist as windows into who these characters are, how they choose to spend their time, and how they perceive their goals. Stay Night does a similar thing, but where there it exists to illustrate the divide between the normal and fantastical in Shiro's life, Apocrypha aims to show what normalcy looks like for those who lead fantastical lives. Between the scheming, we get to see moments of flirty banter between Amakusa and Semiramis. Between the brutality, we get to see Jack and Reika's tender moments as mother and daughter. Between his fights on the front lines, we briefly touch on Karna's routine of checking up on his mind-controlled master. Most of these are short moments in their own right, but they're glances into what brings these characters happiness. Reflections of what their lives would be like, not relegated to the fleeting nature of the Holy Grail War. Taking so many of these scenes and breezing past them or cutting them altogether is exactly why the anime feels like it's missing so much. They're what provide the answer to its central question, because as Astolfo states in its beginning and Sieg in its end, it's these moments of simple, mundane happiness which the series wants to say make for a life well spent. Not doing justice to the scenes that validate that theme, that allow the audience to emotionally buy into it, is equivalent to cutting out the series' very heart. Sieg suffers the most from this, even if, as the main character, he has among the least amount of downtime cut. Because he needs to be the mouthpiece for that theme, and given that it comes across as so hollow once he comes to state it, it only reflects poorly on his status as the protagonist. This is supposed to be the moment that hammers home the story's message, and in it, the audience feels neither emotional attachment towards the way anime Sieg embodies that message, nor the satisfaction from feeling that statement is a culmination of the series' totality. So, what does that imply a version of the story and of Sieg that doesn't fall into that trap needs to accomplish? Well, the main way that Sieg explores the story's theme is his bonds. So, even more than getting the reader to care about Sieg individually, it's important that they care about the happiness he finds with Jeanne and Astolfo. That's why the video title is plural and why there's so much ground to cover. Sieg, from his emotional appeal to his thematic role to his development, is intrinsically tied to his deuteragonists. I really didn't feel I'd be doing any of these characters justice if I didn't cover them as a collective. So, I want to break down everything, from what makes Sieg himself a compelling character, to his dynamics with the characters close to him, to his place as the story's protagonist. That all being said, some of the manga's biggest improvements come earlier in that list than you may expect. I'll get to the more in-depth character and relationship analysis in a bit, but as a start, I want to talk about how Sieg himself is presented to the audience. His personality, and what's done to make him sympathetic and likable. That might sound pretty basic and like it's not worth much analysis, but because it's so foundational, I'd actually argue it's one of the areas where the differences in portrayal are most important, and one of the anime's biggest sticking points. Within the Fate fandom, criticism against Sieg is often jokingly shorthanded to nicknaming him cardboard, and that can connotate a number of things, like being generic or flat. But I think the biggest contributor is people finding him just boring. I can totally understand that. Sieg is a stoic protagonist surrounded by a number of characters with more expressive, eye-catching personalities than him. But the problem is a little more nuanced than Sieg just being bland. since the traits that make him fairly uninteresting in the anime are still necessary parts of his character. As I said at the top, what makes Sieg such a thematically interesting protagonist is that he allows the series to examine what makes a person and their experiences human through the lens of someone who doesn't see themselves as such. Sieg, initially, has no goal, no emotional attachments. He doesn't even believe he can feel emotions. It makes for a very unique way for the series to carry out its exploration of the human condition, as Sieg has the cognitive ability to question and find his own way through it, yet begins entirely oblivious to its implications. In such a short span of time, he's forced to reckon with the full breadth of life, from the love to the pain. Also, the story can ask him, is it all worth it? It's a character concept that I honestly love, but from an audience investment standpoint, it's also a borderline paradox. What is there to make us care about Sieg finding his purpose, his relationships, his humanity, when he starts without any of it? What exists to spark any initial intrigue in or sympathy for his journey? The light novel can obviously get around this through the nuance and understanding gained from being in a character's head, but why am I choosing to highlight this in contrast to the manga? Simple. Expressiveness might be Akira Ishida's biggest strength as a mangaka. My go-to example for this is this spread from Chapter 1. In my opinion, both other versions of the story fail to make much of the Yggdrasillia family interesting initially, if ever. Ishida, while not necessarily fixing the worst ones, introduces them all in a manner that allows the reader to glimpse what they're about, both individually and collectively. Callus's exasperated, nervous mannerisms give a clear indication of how he's going to act, but that then contrasts Gord, who, while similarly apprehensive, is obviously trying to feign stalwart readiness. The two of them, as well as Selenica's less complicated, sinister excitement, then serve to make Roche's plastered smile and Fiore's uniquely composed confidence genuinely intriguing. This level of quality persists throughout the whole series. From the subtle to the more exaggerated, Ishida excels at painting characters' emotions onto their faces. It's honestly the biggest reason I can recommend the manga. It made me connect with so much of the cast by heightening their emotions, and by proxy, mine. When going back over both versions for this video, I was shocked how many scenes were vivid favorites from the manga that I didn't even remember being in the anime, just because the pacing and direction doesn't emphasize them as much. Even compared to Higashide's prose and what I read of the light novel, I often found the expression work in Ishida's art did a better job of planting me in the mood of a scene. That character acting is a big boon to a character like Sieg. Yes, manga Sieg is still a fairly stoic guy, but Ishida makes use of everything that feeds into that stoicism. His inability to process his own emotions, his feelings of responsibility for the life that Siegfried and Astolfo gave him, and the fear of living up to those responsibilities. Because Ishida's character acting is so strong, those subtleties can define Sieg more, and that's what we can connect to. His apparent emotionlessness is partially rooted in how overwhelmed he feels. Mostly, this is done by playing up his confusion and awkwardness in many scenes, hammering home how unsure and unfamiliar he is, while also making him feel more like, well, a teenager. Often socially oblivious and just trying to keep his head above water while navigating these unfamiliar emotional positions. He has several panels that I think are genuinely kind of adorable. One of my favorite examples, and one of the starkest differences in approach, is his date with Jeanne during the Jack arc. I love how stiffly the manga portrays him here. The way he jolts or just looks around nervously whenever Jeanne tries to direct his attention away from the matter of Jack. The only time he looks resolute is when he's considering his actual task. He's far more uneasy trying to navigate a simple day out. That's not only some meaningful characterization in its own right, but the way Jeanne's able to get him to loosen up and really enjoy himself creates a moment that makes their bond feel both sincere and significant. Compare that to the anime, and not only is that same contrast from tension to levity not really conveyed through the way Sieg is drawn and animated, Natsuki Hane's delivery...
では行こう。ジャック・ザ・リッパーは必ず。はい、アウトです。努力する。
It's very consistent and subdued, almost monotone. To be clear, that's not a critique of him as a VA, the man's extremely talented. Rather, it's indicative of the fact that leaning into Sieg's quote-unquote emotionlessness was an intentional and evidently flawed choice in the direction of the anime. That's a serious shame, because I really think that if Sieg had been allowed to feel like just a little bit more of a character, a little bit more of a person, he wouldn't be as much of a sore spot for Apocrypha as he is. I don't doubt that some people would still take issue with him on some technical writing points, but I can't imagine he'd be as maligned if he got to be more, ironically, animated. But what's more important, as shown with the Jeanne example, is how this stronger character acting also makes Manga Sieg's connections feel far more palpable. Those connections, in turn, contextualize his own personality and growth. And all of that starts with Astolfo. You could take everything I said about Sieg's personality making him a difficult sell, and apply the exact reverse to Astolfo. It's no wonder that if anyone came out of Apocrypha's anime as fan favorites, it was him and Mordred. From voice direction to character animation, the anime did nail translating the liveliest member of its cast to the screen. That, combined with Astolfo's prominence and, frankly, simplicity, means there's very little to worry about in terms of cut character work from the source material. In all three versions of the story, Astolfo stands as a wonderfully effective character. Though his role is to introduce the themes of living life moment by moment, he's not exactly a paragon of that idea, since for Astolfo, that ideal is represented by a true adventurer's unadulterated chaotic freedom. That wrinkle alone is wildly impactful, taking moments that are technically just Astolfo stating the story's thesis, and injecting them with such a level of charisma and emotion that it not only makes the scene feel specifically character relevant and engaging, but it makes that message feel appropriately inspirational. Likewise, he helps a lot to bolster Sieg's early character presence, especially through the stretch of story where the homunculus is still too impish and ill-defined to have much of his own. Astolfo's hard-on-his-sleeve nature and his dedication to heroic conduct mean it's easy to understand why he's so immediately caring towards Sieg, which is an awfully efficient way to lay the groundwork for their friendship, though in terms of making that bond a more convincing two-way street, as well as emphasizing its strength and importance, the superior characterization of the manga is instrumental. I'm not gonna harp too much on this, because oftentimes the most efficient way to drive investment in a friendship between characters is just making their lighter scenes together fun. And with Apocrypha's theme specifically, it's crucial that their relationship feels like one that could have spent normal day-by-day time together if given the opportunity. Effortless charm is the name of the game here, and as if Astolfo himself doesn't provide enough of that, Sieg growing to no-sell everything the writer comes up with is the most fun thing in the series. It's not that Sieg's completely unfazed by his energy, we see early on how overwhelmed he can get by it, but seeing that decrease to just slight exasperation really communicates how Sieg gets used to it. That's his best friend. He knows how to ride the wave of Astolfo's antics. And what makes it all the more convincing is how he's seemingly the only person who can. One of my favorite details in the series is how, aside from Chiron and his patience of a divine mentor, Sieg is the only character in the series capable of keeping any degree of composure when with Astolfo. It's probably my favorite way Sieg's stoicism is used as a personality trait rather than the lack of one. In that way, Astolfo's larger-than-life personality serves as a kind of measuring stick for Sieg's strengthening sense of self. His growth from meek ward to a master capable of standing right next to that servant is subtly quantified by his ability to tolerate shenanigans. That sense of growth is also leveraged for some powerful emotional beats between them. Whenever Astolfo's there to see Sieg take a major step, I really resonate with that sense of pride he feels watching that scared boy he saved stand and know what his life is for. My favorite of those moments is the last one, where Sieg echoes the speech he was given at the start of the story. It is a tried and true way to demonstrate a character's growth, but the fact that he returns Astolfo's inspiration while giving him a similar opportunity through true incarnation is a beautiful way of showing how much those words meant to Sieg, how much this bond has meant to both of them, how Sieg only made it this far because he had the Pink Paladin by his side. And in fairness, I think the anime depicts all that decently. For reasons I've already discussed, I think it misses a lot of the texture and nuances of their dynamic, but Astolfo's such a well-done loose cannon that having anyone there to straight man for him would have been decently entertaining. And that alone means this is probably where anime Sieg is at his best. I wish I could afford that much to the anime's treatment of its third main character. Okay, before I can even talk about the relationship between Sieg and Jeanne, there's a lot to be said on how the anime mishandled Jeanne in her own right. Arguably more so than Sieg. With him, I got what the anime was going for, it just missed on the execution. But Reading the light novel and manga, I found that I saw Jeanne as a vastly different character than I had previously. Jeanne is supposed to be the ideal representative for Apocrypha's main themes. She's a character who's already come to her answer on the question of whether life's hardships make its pleasures worth it, and that answer is a resounding yes. The tragedies she's seen and experienced still color her personality. She's notably pragmatic and world-weary, but never jaded. In fact, much the opposite. She's the greatest source of optimism and empathy in the story, the ultimate advocate for humanity. I'm not gonna say none of that comes across in the anime, some of it is just flat out in the text. But I can't help but find it less believable in that incarnation with the stoic veneer it wants to give her, putting a greater emphasis on her sense of duty as ruler, and only letting her open up more in a few select moments. Part of that is, again, down to general character acting differences. Ishida rounds out her design a bit, brightens up a lot of her expressions in lighter moments, and seems to give her this air of knowing reassurance in more severe ones. But in this case, I think the bigger culprit is that the anime outright cuts a lot of Jeanne's early establishing character beats. As a tame example, Jeanne really doesn't do that much in Volume 1 of the light novel. In fact, she does so little that sans the major encounter with Siegfried and Karna, even the manga cuts most of it. But experiencing her road trip from France to Romania completely redefined how I saw her when I first read it. All her scenes in the volume are about her taking in the experience, not as a servant, but as a person, marveling at everything from the scenery to the company of the people she meets to modern advancements as simple as a math textbook. Letting her introduction be this understated was probably the best way to make her kindness and appreciation of life feel so genuine, and it works to great effect. So that's a slight loss, but the manga doesn't have it either, and those traits still come across fine. Where the anime really misses out is the content from Volume 2 of the light novel, or chapters 16 and 17 of the manga, namely a series of 3 scenes following Siegfried's death. The biggest change is the anime having Jeanne present for this event to begin with. In the original, she's not. Her ruler-class skills alert her to the fact that Saber of Black seems simultaneously dead and alive, which she then investigates, first by questioning Vlad, then Astolfo, and lastly Sieg himself. Each of these scenes demonstrates a different side of her. Vlad wields her tragedy against her in attempts to sway her to aiding the Black faction, which prompts us to see Jeanne's more resolute, realist side. This interaction serves to dismiss any perception of Jeanne as naive. None of those tragedies, not even her own death, hold any power over her, because Jeanne accepts the sacrifices made while fighting for what she believes in, whether that be her own death as in her backstory and the climax, or conceding some of her idealism as happens multiple times during the Jack arc. Those concessions never come at the cost of her hopefulness, because her faith, both in humanity as a whole and her literal faith, is strong enough to maintain her belief that eventually the most ideal outcome will be found. That side of her, the caring and insightful saint, comes out in her conversation with Astolfo, containing one of my favorite lines from her in the series, when she tells him, deep down, she hopes all the Grail Wars participants will be victors. She says this knowing that outcome isn't possible taken at face value, but believing there's still a way for each of them to find their own personal victories. As an aside, I also think this scene is nice for giving more of a basis to the friendship between these two, beyond just both of them being close to Sieg. Speaking of, the last of these conversations is by far the most important. This moment is in the anime, but plays out differently as Jeanne more so educates Sieg, then sees him off on his way to live with Sergei. In the light novel and manga, this conversation firstly serves to contrast the previous two. Being that he's effectively a civilian for now, Jeanne doesn't speak to Sieg with the same formality she has with the other servants. We see some of the carefree pleasure from her light novel introduction return. She also continues to fulfill her role as a sort of guide, as seeing Sieg's desire to save the other homunculi and his lack of direction, she decides to stick with him for a time. Yeah, the anime cuts them living together, the entire inciting incident for their relationship. And as a rebound from that, I think it also misses the tone of the conversation itself. What strikes me here is the same thing that struck me during Volume 1 of the light novel, how vulnerable Jeanne is. Not just because it's a strong foundation for her chemistry with Sieg, but because it shows us Jeanne's character in her most honest state. The lack of this sequence means a lack of seeing the layers to Jeanne's personality. Like I said, it gives me the impression that the anime wanted to present her first and foremost as servant ruler. And I don't think that's the heart of her character. To me, beyond being the arbiter of the Grail War or a war hero or even a holy saint, at the core of Jeanne's character, she's still that hopeful village girl. Hardened by all those experiences, but not buried. Looking at her through that lens changed my opinion a lot, and recontextualized future scenes that, while important enough to be present and largely unchanged in the anime, hit way harder in the manga due to their presentation and additional perspective. That'll be the case for most of what I discuss from this point onward, and perhaps the most prominent example of that is how Jeanne's relationship with Sieg went from one I couldn't care less about to one of my favorite romances in all of Fate. When trying to describe why I enjoy the way these two interact so much, I found I always defaulted to natural as a descriptor. In much the same way I feel Sieg's overall character presence mirrors the general teenage or young adult experience by focusing on his uneasiness in defining himself, his relationship with Jeanne evokes a lot of that awkward, bubbly warmness we associate with our idealized mental image of young love. As a starting point, both their personalities being so down-to-earth goes a long way. From their first interaction, they bounce off each other very comfortably. Jeanne responds to Sieg's naivety with some exasperated but friendly chiding, while Sieg loosely rebuttals with all the fruitless conviction of not wanting to admit your friend has a point. Jeanne gets smug about it, Sieg gets a little sassy at her poorly timed hunger, they banter is what I'm saying. Not with the appeal of snippy sarcasm, but in a way that makes their interactions feel casual and authentic. There are a handful of moments like this that continue to endear the reader through lighthearted comedy, and they're extremely charming, especially with Astolfo thrown in. But what I think makes this couple something really special is how you can see that sense of comfort create and then compound upon their growing feelings for one another. There's a subtle but very noticeable shift in both characters' demeanors when they share their company. With Sieg, he's simply far more composed and confident around Jeanne than he is with anyone else. Especially early on, his ability to have an actual back and forth with her is a noticeable contrast to how other characters' personalities have swept up and overwhelmed him. But it's also evident in his ability to muster much more resolve when around her. Almost every time he's more articulate and introspective, or makes a point with more determination, it's in conversation with her. What I especially appreciate is that those more introspective moments aren't sudden monologues, but happen naturally through the dialogue between the two of them. It all convincingly paints Sieg as most in tune with and able to express himself when around Jeanne. And the same is equally true in reverse. As I mentioned before, that outgoing, jovial side of Jeanne that she's introduced with comes out the most in her scenes with Sieg. Her smiles are more full, and man does Ishida love drawing those smiles. She excitedly embraces her brief opportunities for normalcy in town, and she's presented with a forwardness that breaks through even the slight restraint of her usual ruler persona. These are the scenes that serve to remind us how, even with the responsibility she's accepted, Jeanne's still just a teenager. Narratively, it's plain enough to see how they're positive influences on the other. But what really makes me connect with their relationship emotionally is how genuine both these shifts feel as responses to being around a loved one. Sieg being the calm that comes from trusting you have someone who understands and accepts you, Jeanne embodying the giddy joy that comes from sharing your time with that person. It's not quite to the point where I'd call their dynamic realistic, but it does feel incredibly earnest and grounded. I think that trait is rather poignant given what this relationship represents in Apocrypha's context. If Apocrypha's main theme is discovering the simple joys that give life meaning, it's fitting for the main couple to evoke a sense of mundanity. Even some of their scenes' framing expands on that idea. Their date in the Jack arc may play up some cliches cliches of romance manga, but it ends up feeling significant as you realize how divorced both characters' circumstances are from these typical motions. These tropey exchanges still feel unexplored here, revealing how innocent Sieg and Jeanne really are, and making this opportunity feel uniquely idyllic. But the scene from their date which sticks out to me the most is this one. After Jeanne explains that Sieg shouldn't look to her as a moral absolute, that even her ideals may earn her opposition, Sieg cuts through the complicated moral questions and reassures her that he believes she's trying her best. Immediately, he reverts Jeanne from the philosophizing servant to a flustered but deeply moved, blushing mess. This is the scene that, to me, really cements what this relationship means to Apocrypha's broader narrative. Where a lot of stories use their romance subplots as sources of drama, Sieg and Jeanne's moments are frequently relief from it. Whenever one gets overwhelmed by the pressures of the war, questioning or tunnel visioning themselves, the other is there to ground them. To me, that's the core of their relationship, the reason they both thematically and emotionally need each other. Thematically, it conveys both their struggle to uphold the series' messaging, showing how important their bond is to keeping them focused on what matters to them and living in the moment, rather than letting themselves be consumed by self-doubt or disillusionment, as is the case for so many other characters in the series. Which is crucial for the mood of their scenes too. That contrast adds importance, weight, and the heavier the burdens they lift for each other, the more the reader is drawn to that feeling of comfortable vulnerability between them. With that perspective, it makes all the endearing quirks that made me buy into their connection take on additional value. It matters that Sieg can open up to Jeanne. It matters that Jeanne can be more carefree around Sieg. It matters that they can be normal around each other, because that chance is what keeps them going. And through the final stretch, it makes them downright inseparable. They both find the other side after escaping Jack's illusion, Jeanne to console and Sieg to give his trust. When the doubt from that harrowing experience lingers with Sieg, Jeanne returns that unconditional faith. And though they're separated for much of the final battle, Sieg utilizes and sacrifices every bit of power he has just to be at Jeanne's side when it matters most. That consistent reliance on each other is the biggest thing that makes their dynamic land for me. The narrative itself encourages you to see these characters as two halves of a whole, because everything they face either together or with their partner in mind. It really hits home the idea of two people starting to walk hand in hand through life, or at least wanting to, had their circumstances allowed it. As an aside, this is also why I don't personally mind the lack of a real confession until the very end. Even if their feelings aren't given an explicit label, the story doesn't take that as an excuse to diminish the significance of their bond. They get to act like more of a couple than several romance subplots I've seen. Even the one time the ambiguity of their relationship is the source of some tension ultimately only reinforces the importance of it. The pair being separated for their penultimate fights creates the opportunity to re-examine the dichotomy between Jeanne's several sides through Shakespeare's first folio. This encounter takes those multiple established facets and forces them into opposition with each other, questioning who Jeanne really is and who she should be. Did becoming that pragmatic war hero mean relinquishing her right to return to just being a normal girl? Given her responsibilities to humanity as a heroic spirit, who should she be allying herself with? And extrapolating her answers from those questions, do her feelings for Sieg contradict her role as a saint, a bastion of love for all humanity? Jeanne, in this moment alone, is confronted with this deluge of questions and ultimatums that for once actually shake her sense of self. It's almost a tough scene to read purely from how vividly Ishida renders her despair. Her distant, almost dissociating moment of shock when she senses Sieg might be dead, the way she crumbles to the floor, her heavy eye bags and weak expressions afterwards. It's all so potent. But what's even more so is how the tone of the scene shifts when Sieg arrives. Having him proudly announce the ideology he learned from Jeanne as his reason to fight is a fantastic symbol of their bond, and a perfect shorthand for what Sieg means to her. Not a love that usurps her duty to humanity, but one that reminds her of it. It's because she's able to be her truest self with him, because being with him allows her to re-experience the purest pleasures of the human condition. Protecting those moments is exactly what Jeanne fights for, exactly what Sieg's grown to fight by her side for. It's her love for that one person that allows her to uphold her love for all humanity, trusting that he'd want her to do what's best for them. Jeanne's sacrifice here also acts as a moment to firmly pass the torch to Sieg, setting the stage for the series' final duel. Now, it's Sieg's moment to declare and live up to the series' themes, which he's come to represent just as much as his companions. Now that we're back here, I'd like to ask a question. Does the ideology Sieg represents mean anything to us, the reader? This time, has enough been done for us to care? For me, that's an undeniable yes. I care about Sieg because this time I've felt his anxiety, his uncertainty, and his growing resolve. I care because of his best friend standing behind him, and this time I've seen the growing confidence that bond has given him. The feelings of brotherhood in their scenes together have only been stronger. I care because this time I believe he loves the girl whose name he fights in. I felt the solace and strength they find in each other. I understand why the series upholds it as something to be cherished. The story has made me care. I want to listen to what it has to say. Which is why this time, I find it far more interesting to reflect on how Sieg got here. Fate Apocrypha is a story about life. More specifically, I think its thematic questions are what gives a human life value, and what makes a life well spent. Nearly each of the series' 20-odd major characters provide unique answers to them, so why is Sieg's journey to arrive at his the series' center? Like with most Fate stories, it's not because Sieg serves the narrative function of coalescing all those disparate threads. While a majority of the cast crosses paths with him, most of their stories conclude independently. Sieg isn't Apocrypha's skeleton, he's its heart. We don't follow him because he's the most important person to the Great Grail War's progression, but rather because he provides those questions' most important answers. Even at our most uncertain, even with our time most limited, what can we take value in? Without a wish, without the pressures of a mage lineage, without a previous life to fall back on, what does our homunculus choose to define as his humanity? Bonds and the time spent cultivating them, as I've talked about at length. He may not get the chance to live out that simple life, but everything he's driven to do, all the fantastical things he experiences, spawn from those two sparks of happiness. I really enjoy it as a means of communicating that theme through a fantasy action story, especially because choosing to value the mundane doesn't let you avoid life's battles. It just means you have something on the other side that makes them worth fighting. Cliché as it sounds on paper, in practice, Sieg's motivation strikes me as remarkably down-to-earth. I think that's largely down to the specificity with which it's framed. Apocrypha, for as much as it values companionship in its themes, seldom, if ever, draws attention to the idea in its vague, holistic form. It emphasizes the reasons that specific characters need other specific characters in their lives. Sieg's not motivated by the ideal of friendship or love or bonds, we're just shown his willingness to follow two particular people to the ends of the earth. And I struggle to call that anything but relatable. What's even more intriguing is how strongly those descriptors contrast what I'd say about almost every other protagonist in a franchise whose leads are generally characterized by rigid, self-destructive personal dogma. Now, despite all my praise, that's still not to say I'd consider Sieg as compelling or nuanced a character as Shiro or Kiritsugu or Bazette, but the fact that they all exist in the same franchise, able to act as comparison points to one another, adds to my intrigue towards all of them. The mage protagonists of the main timeline are literally human, but a core theme across those stories is how detached they are from the quote-unquote normal human experience. Sieg, the homunculus, may lack their intense drives at the start of his story, but when he comes to acquire his own, it spurs from a far more passionate, emotionally driven place. Actually, come to think of it, I wonder if that's an intentional parallel to Ilya and Iris. Nope, this video is too long, I'm not going there. Perhaps the most important factor in making Sieg's answers satisfying and a relevant centerpiece for the series is how thoroughly he searches for them. He takes little bits of understanding from almost everyone he meaningfully interacts with. Beyond his best friends or the hero who saved his life, he reflects on insights Chiron gave him about humanity's need for bonds. His empathy towards Jack and Reika deepens his understanding of humanity's capacity for suffering. To further interrogate that revelation, he seeks counsel from Mordred. Even his speech before his final duel with Amakusa is framed over a collage of everyone who's been an influence on him. That incremental development, the way every conclusion he reaches can be traced back to his interaction with another character and how he interprets their words, creates a web of intersecting scenes and gives substance to his position as protagonist. He frames the wider story not by exerting his own influence over the narrative, but through how its several differing viewpoints influence him. That's still not to say he has no agency. While his conversations with other characters frame his introspection and curiosity, his fights showcase how strong his sense of purpose is at each point they occur. Sieg's first proactive actions are motivated entirely by obligation and indebtedness. He returns to the battlefield at the Fortress of Millennia with the goal of freeing the other homunculi, more specifically, allowing them the same opportunity he was granted. His ensuing fight against Mordred only happens because he sees her about to kill Astolfo, stepping in because Astolfo had previously saved him. I'm not saying Sieg's actions here are without emotional investment, but it's based on a logical paradigm, that it's only fair for him to return what he's received. The battle against Avisabron, or at least his reflections following it, reframe that paradigm as a growing desire in him, a want to not just repay what his peers are owed, but to be useful. Sieg begins to understand what it means to value and be valued by others. His growing sense of closeness to Jeanne and Astolfo only furthers his want to aid them, quantifying his own worth by his capacity to further the ends of those he cares about. So, when Jack comes on the scene, threatening those individuals, killing the other homunculi, it's the first time Sieg treats something as his fight. By this point, he's taken to referring to the other homunculi as his siblings. That connection leads him to facing Jack with an animosity, a belief in retribution that he's not had to this point. A belief that the arc challenges relentlessly. This is the section of the story that most broadens Sieg's worldview, showing him the depths of depravity that humans can both create and be forced to suffer through, and at least partially dismantling the morals he'd begun to operate under. In recognizing that Jack and Reika are themselves a family and victims of circumstance akin to himself, he's also forced to internalize the fact that the actions taken for or by the people he perceives as good aren't unambiguously so. Suddenly, he knows that ideal hero he sees in Siegfried or Astolfo or Jeanne isn't always right. And lastly, Jack poses Sieg a question. Now that he's aware of suffering, does he still wish to live? How can he even begin to trust that he knows right from wrong, that he has something worth fighting for? That question recontextualizes Sieg's view of his connections. From there, he can grow to see them not as an absolute morality or purpose, but simply as something precious to him. And it's that realization that allows him to go from his point of most doubt to betting everything against Karna. This is the first time we see Sieg muster powerful personal purpose. Throwing away his strength and his body is nothing in the face of being at Jeanne's side. Not because it has to be right, but because he himself is sure of it. That's the strength of ideology necessary to earn the respect of a heroic spirit. In fact, it grows so strong that it also earns the unyielding ire of another. As a final challenge for Sieg, Amakusa works brilliantly. Someone who, like him, lived a fairly short life, but one marred at its end by failure and agony. His aim to remove those vices from humanity is his means to the same end that Sieg's been learning to chase all series, making the most of life. Of course, he seeks the impossible. As the series declares, a life without struggle is a life of stagnation. A compromise Amakusa's willing to make, but Sieg, who is only here to face him because he had the courage to power through his suffering as well as the suffering he witnessed, refuses to counter that dogma. This fight is so satisfying because Sieg feels complete, fully in tune with himself, able to articulate his admiration for the human spirit. Finally, he knows with certainty what he believes in. But what really gets me is how vigorously he opposes Amakusa. There's something undeniably cathartic about seeing a character who's been so ambivalent towards his own emotions get deservedly angry. Not in the anime rage power-up way A1's version tries to echo, but personally genuinely indignant towards Amakusa for the harm he's caused Jeanne and for his lack of faith in humanity. Sieg lets himself feel and trusts that feeling. And Amakusa, his convictions just as strong, responds in kind. An acknowledgement of Sieg as someone who drives him to rage that feels empowering in its own right. This fight's greatest strength is how Ishida is able to frame it in a manner that feels less like a fated final duel, and more like a grudge-fueled rivalry. A clashing of ideologies so clearly at odds that all there's left to express is how much they hate each other's guts. What gives Sieg the passion to rush through this final fight is really rather simple. The fact that that's all he needs is not just fulfilling, it drives the emotion of this fight to a height that makes it a strong contender for Apocrypha's best, among a roster as solid as you'd expect from a Fate series. Or, I mean, it would, were it not for how that action happens. The plotting through Apocrypha's ending is unfortunately one of the flaws that seems to pervade all versions of the story, at least as far as I can gather. Blasted Tree's ability to be passed down and create a second Frankenstein's monster, the power that lets Sieg even participate in his final fight, is barely foreshadowed in the well over half a series between Fran's death and this scene. While I can appreciate that it's at least thematically consistent, giving Sieg the opportunity to carry on the wishes and will of a fellow artificial human, it's no less jarring and unsatisfying as a solution when it happens. That goes double for how the Grail itself is dealt with. Despite the light novel's in medias res opening being a cryptic telling of Sieg and Jeanne's reunion there, the reverse side of the world is never once mentioned as a facet of the world building, let alone a potential solution, until the moment it's needed. I don't know if parts of the light novel that I haven't found translations of at least set up these details a little beforehand, but it remains a pretty glaring issue with the manga. And yet, it's one that I can forgive. Because for as clumsily introduced as these elements of the plot's conclusion are, the series doesn't take them as easy outs for its thematic answers and emotional resolutions. Blasted Tree doesn't rob Sieg of the growth his fight with Amakusa demonstrates, nor of the emotions it brings out of him, nor of the philosophy that drives him to fight it. And Reverse Side, poorly established though it may be, facilitates an ending I adore. Sieg's borrowed time finally runs out as he turns into Fafnir, and all he seeks to do is give Astolfo the greatest gift he can, and carry out what Jeanne would have wanted. That satisfies him. In cutting our protagonist's life short, we see how much he appreciated it. And from there on, I have no complaints at all. I think Astolfo getting fully incarnated and running off to the next adventure is pretty much a perfect ending for him, an encapsulation of all his passion for life. And while I won't touch on them here, I think everyone else's wrap-ups also range from charming and satisfying to the best scene in the entire series, but that's for another day. But I don't think anything could have more firmly solidified my attachment to this story, and especially its protagonists, than its very last note. Fate's first love story also ended with a homecoming at the end of time. In a sense, it makes it difficult to not see this epilogue in the shadow of the iconography it pays homage to. But part of what I love about Fate is how it uses themes and aesthetics to parallel stories that don't directly tie into one another. And here, that similar premise not only suits Apocrypha's protagonists just as well, it creates a scene that resonates for very different reasons than its inspiration. Shiro and Saber's story is one of recognizing when it's necessary to forge your own path, even apart from the person you love. Sieg and Jeanne's story is built on reaffirming their purpose through their companionship, and their separation is caused by sacrifices for a common belief. Where that reunion felt like a distant miracle, this feels like a long-sought resolution. Shiro and Artoria reunite once they've become fulfilled versions of themselves. Sieg and Jeanne's reunion is what fulfills them. This scene feels like being made whole again. The beautiful, silent build-up leading into Jeanne's first spoken line being a promise to never again leave Sieg's side really lets you take in how that eternity apart has weighed on her. It sets up for all those prior feelings of warmth to come rushing back as the interaction continues. Sieg's immediate readiness to start on a new journey together, Jeanne getting so swept up in that her confession either slips her mind or comes to her spontaneously, and the coy way she transitions into announcing it. Each of these mini moments is some of the liveliest we've seen these two all series. All that weight just dissipates. I find it a really interesting use of understatement, because there's no big tearful embrace like you may expect. Instead, the characters focus on what's in front of them. In turn, the scene becomes centered on not the end of their isolation, but their joy in being together. The distance wasn't necessary to make that something profound. The result is the height of Ishida's expressive character work. I adore everything about this penultimate full-page spread of Jeanne. The way it acts as a beat of silence for her to steel herself like a deep breath in, as if after an eternity these feelings are still strong enough to warrant the butterflies of a first confession. There's relief and excitement and adoration all bundled into this one expression. And with one flip, we resolve that silence with the most cathartic page in Apocrypha. Honestly, I think this was a risk well taken. Saving the confirmation of the main character's romance for the literal last line could have easily seemed drawn out. But this feels so unlike almost any other confession scene I can think of. It's not the nervousness of being vulnerable with feelings that anticipate an unknowable response, it's the confident eagerness of finally putting words to the feelings that have gotten these two here. That love not feeling new is what makes it so gratifying to see expressed. In another sense, it also feels right to me that we end on the start of something. The start of these two getting to finally walk through life side by side, day by day. To me, this ending ties together all those feelings of comfort and inspiration and now excitement, and it's just so cute. Apocrypha's ending was some of the most closure I felt with any story. Not just closure on the series itself, but on my perception of it. Finally laying that initial disappointment to rest, free from the feeling that I was watching something I could love, and left with another Fate story I do love. The mangas almost entirely usurped the anime in my mind as my experience with the story. I can hardly connect anymore with a lot of my initial impressions, especially of its characters. I went into the manga thinking of Sieg as an interesting concept, that a homunculus would be a uniquely fitting protagonist for a story about human nature. Now, that neat writing trick, while a very notable part of what makes him effective, is secondary to how invested I became in his characterization. I don't look back on him and just go, cool idea, anymore. I look back on him and, generally, I think of one of these three scenes. Either one of the moments of normalcy and the characters just hanging out, or their final reward for valuing that. That's what Apocrypha is to me now. It still has flaws, I still have critiques with it, but I didn't bring them up here because I don't want this to be a review. I'm not weighing everything the story does well against everything it does poorly, I just want to talk about what I've come to appreciate in it. And with that perspective, wasted potential is the furthest thing from my mind when regarding a story that achieves its main goal so thoroughly. It's a story that returns to Fate Route's initial conceit and expands on it greatly, eking out little pockets of happiness and connection despite limited time and the need to fight to uphold them. I think those bonds across time have always been my favorite part of Fate. It's the reason Hollow Atraxia is still my favorite installment in the franchise. It allows the characters to push themselves between the line of myth and person, and a lot of Apocrypha's low-key moments accomplish the same. With that structure, Apocrypha creates a trio of main characters who have extremely endearing dynamics, palpably influence and grow from each other, and two bonds that still stick out to me among the plethora of relationships in Fate canon. And these three aren't even my favorite characters in the series. But those will be future videos, ones that I'd love to be able to write with less need for convincing. So if anything I've said about these parts of the series sounds like it might work for you, maybe give Apocrypha a second or hell first chance, and see if the rest does too. See what a change in medium and some extra context can accomplish. Speaking personally, I came away from my first watch of Fate Apocrypha disappointed. My first read of Fate Apocrypha ended with me completely fulfilled.